Today, we're talking about something that confuses, unsettles, and quietly empowers people who have walked away from toxic dynamics. What it really means when a narcissist and you both go no contact. On the surface, it may look mutual. It may look balanced. It may even feel like closure. But psychologically, emotionally, and energetically, this silence is not the same on both sides. For you, no contact is often an act of self-preservation. It comes after exhaustion, after self-doubt, after trying to explain your pain to someone who could never truly hear it. It is not about punishment. It is about reclaiming your nervous system, your clarity, your sense of self. You step away not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself. For a narcissistic individual, silence operates differently. It is rarely about healing. It is about control, image management, and emotional regulation through avoidance. When they stop reaching out, it isn't always peace they are choosing. Often, it's strategy. Distance becomes a way to protect their fragile sense of superiority when they can no longer dominate the narrative. This is why mutual no contact feels so disorienting. You may wonder if they've changed, if they've moved on, if the pain meant nothing. But what's actually happening is a quiet psychological split. One person is growing inward, learning boundaries, and tolerating discomfort in service of healing. The other is suppressing, deflecting, and waiting for validation to come from somewhere else. Today's conversation is not about them. It's about you understanding why this silence feels heavy at first, why it later becomes lighter, and why the absence that once hurt eventually turns into proof of your strength. Because when both walk away, the one who chose no contact to heal always walks away freer. When silence becomes the battlefield, it no longer looks like raised voices or slammed doors. It looks like unanswered messages, blocked numbers, and the unsettling quiet that follows a long history of emotional chaos. On the surface, it appears that both people have walked away, but beneath that stillness, two very different internal experiences are unfolding, and only one of them is losing control. For you, silence is not easy at first. It can feel unnatural, even cruel, especially if you are conditioned to explain yourself, to soothe, to fix, or to chase resolution. The absence of contact brings withdrawal, like symptoms because your nervous system became accustomed to emotional highs and lows. Yet over time, that same silence begins to regulate you. Your thoughts slow down. Your body stops bracing for the next emotional ambush. You begin to realize how much energy was spent managing someone else's moods at the expense of your own stability. For a narcissistic individual, silence is not calming. It is destabilizing. Their sense of self is externally regulated, dependent on attention, reaction, and emotional engagement. When that supply is removed, the quiet becomes threatening. It forces them to sit with feelings they are not equipped to process: emptiness, shame, and loss of control. Even if they appear indifferent on the outside, internally the lack of access creates agitation, rumination, and a need to regain dominance over the narrative. This is where silence becomes a battlefield, not because of what is said, but because of what can no longer be controlled. You are no longer responding on cue. You are no longer available to be provoked, reassured, or blamed. Your absence disrupts the familiar power dynamic. The battlefield shifts from external conflict to internal reckoning, and that is a place where narcissistic patterns struggle to survive. Meanwhile, you begin to reclaim territory within yourself. You notice moments of peace that once felt impossible. You rediscover interests, preferences, and emotional space that had been crowded out. Silence becomes a teacher, showing you how much noise was never yours to carry. Each day without contact strengthens your capacity to tolerate discomfort without self betrayal. Only one person loses control in this quiet standoff. It is not the one learning to self-soothe, to hold boundaries, and to choose clarity over chaos. Control is lost by the one who needed access to regulate their identity. As the silence stretches on, it stops being a battlefield and becomes a boundary, a clear line between who you were when you were entangled and who you are becoming now. No contact often gets misunderstood as a shared decision, a clean break where both people are finally free. But when you step away from a narcissistic dynamic, the freedom is not mutual, even if the silence appears equal. What feels like relief and peace to you can feel like an existential threat to the other person, because your absence does not simply remove a relationship, it disrupts an identity built on control and external validation. For you, no contact is an act of recovery. It is the moment you stop negotiating your worth, stop explaining your pain, and stop participating in cycles that kept you emotionally dysregulated. At first, the quiet can feel unsettling. You may replay conversations, question your decision, or feel guilt for choosing distance. But gradually, something shifts. Your nervous system settles. You begin to experience clarity instead of confusion, rest instead of hypervigilance. Peace becomes possible because you are no longer reacting, performing, or defending yourself. For a narcissistic individual, that same peace is deeply destabilizing. Their sense of self is often dependent on being needed, admired, feared, or reacted to. When you disengage, you are no longer reinforcing that fragile structure. Your calm becomes a mirror reflecting what they lack: internal stability. This is why your silence can provoke anger, dismissal, or sudden indifference. It is not because they are unbothered, but because they are trying to protect an identity that cannot tolerate irrelevance. Your peace threatens them because it exposes the truth that their power was never inherent. It was relational. It existed only as long as you participated. When you stop responding, stop explaining, and stop offering emotional access, the dynamic collapses. They may frame no contact as their choice, their strength, or their indifference, but beneath that narrative is a loss of control that feels intolerable. Meanwhile, your freedom grows quietly. You begin to trust your perceptions again. You stop scanning for emotional landmines. You realize how much of your energy was once spent managing someone else's feelings while neglecting your own. No contact gives you the space to rebuild your identity on self-connection rather than survival. This is why no contact is not mutual freedom. One person is learning how to exist without external chaos, while the other is struggling with the absence of supply. Your peace is not an attack, yet it feels like one to someone whose identity depended on disruption. As you continue choosing calm, clarity, and boundaries, you are not just walking away from a relationship. You are stepping out of a system that required your distress to function, and that choice changes everything when both of you walk away. It can look identical from the outside. No messages, no calls, no visible connection, but the reasons behind that silence could not be more different, and that difference quietly determines who heals and who stays trapped. You left to heal. They left to regain power, and understanding this distinction changes how you interpret the entire experience. You did not leave impulsively. You left after trying to communicate, after minimizing your needs, after questioning your own reality. Walking away was not about winning or proving a point. It was about survival. You reached a moment where your body and mind could no longer tolerate the emotional volatility, the self-doubt, the constant vigilance. No contact became the only path back to yourself. Healing, for you, is uncomfortable work. It requires sitting with grief, anger, and confusion without external distraction. It means learning to self-soothe instead of self-abandon. For a narcissistic individual, leaving often serves a very different function. Distance becomes a tool rather than a process. Withdrawing is a way to punish, to provoke longing, or to reset the power dynamic. It is not about reflection or accountability. It is about regaining control over how they are perceived and how the story is told. Silence is used strategically, not therapeutically. The goal is not growth, but leverage. This is why the silence feels so heavy at first for you and strangely performative for them. You are doing internal work that has no audience. They are managing an image even when no one is watching. You are tolerating the loss of familiarity in order to build something healthier. They are avoiding vulnerability by framing withdrawal as strength. Over time, this difference becomes visible in subtle but meaningful ways. Your days become quieter but also more grounded. You begin to notice emotional stability replacing chaos. Your sense of self slowly returns, no longer shaped by someone else's reactions. You stop needing validation to trust your experience. Healing does not make you instantly happy, but it makes you whole. Meanwhile, power regained through withdrawal is fragile. It depends on the hope that you will notice, miss, or reach out. When that does not happen, the sense of control erodes. Without engagement, there is nothing to push against, nothing to dominate. What looked like strength becomes emptiness. This is the difference that changes everything. Healing builds resilience. Power built on control collapses without participation. You did not walk away to hurt them. You walked away to save yourself. And in choosing recovery over control, you step into a future where silence is no longer a weapon, but a space where your identity can finally breathe when both of you stop speaking. It can feel like a shared ending, a neutral pause where nothing is happening. But shared silence is rarely neutral. It creates a quiet divide that reveals something essential about the relationship that once existed. In that stillness, it becomes clear who was dependent on the dynamic for regulation, and who was already moving toward freedom long before the final goodbye. For you, the silence may initially feel like loss. The absence of communication can stir anxiety, grief, and a longing for familiarity, even when that familiarity was painful. This is not weakness. It is the nervous system recalibrating after prolonged emotional unpredictability. You are conditioned to respond, to anticipate moods, to manage outcomes. When that role disappears, your system needs time to relearn safety without constant engagement. But as the days pass, something subtle changes. The silence begins to feel less like abandonment and more like relief. You notice how much mental space opens up when you are no longer decoding messages or preparing emotional defenses. Your energy starts returning to you. You begin to experience moments of calm that once felt unreachable. This is not because the past no longer matters, but because you are no longer living inside it. For a narcissistic individual, shared silence exposes dependence in a different way. Their sense of stability often relies on external responses, on being mirrored, challenged, admired, or feared. When communication stops, there is no feedback loop to reinforce identity. The quiet becomes uncomfortable, even threatening. Without engagement, there is nothing to anchor their sense of self. What looks like independence on the surface is often avoidance underneath. This is where the divide becomes unmistakable. You are learning to tolerate discomfort in service of growth. They are avoiding discomfort to preserve a fragile internal structure. You are sitting with emotions to understand them. They are suppressing emotions to escape them. Shared silence magnifies these differences because it removes distraction and forces each person to face themselves. Over time, your freedom becomes less about the absence of the other person and more about the presence of yourself. You make choices without fear of retaliation. You trust your perceptions. You stop needing validation from someone who could never give it consistently. The silence no longer feels heavy. It feels spacious. The quiet divide is not created by no contact itself, but by what each person does within it. One uses the silence to heal, to grow, and to reclaim autonomy. The other waits for the silence to end so control can return. In that waiting, dependence is revealed. In your becoming, freedom takes shape as this chapter closes. It's important to understand that silence was never the enemy. What hurt was the dynamic that required your constant presence, your emotional labor, and your self-doubt to survive. No contact did not erase the past, but it gave you something far more valuable than explanations or apologies, space to come back to yourself. You may still have moments of longing, confusion, or grief. Healing is not linear, and freedom does not arrive all at once. But notice how your life now moves with less tension. Notice how your body no longer braces for conflict that hasn't happened yet. That is not accidental. That is the result of choosing boundaries over chaos and self-respect over familiarity. Shared silence revealed the truth you could not see while you were entangled. You were never weak for caring. You were simply strong enough to leave when caring cost you yourself. The quiet did not break you. It clarified you. It showed you that peace does not require permission, and closure does not require conversation. As you move forward, remember this: freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself or demand validation. It grows quietly in the spaces where you once abandoned yourself. And when you finally recognize that calm is your new normal, you will understand that walking away was not a loss. It was the beginning of a life that belongs fully to you.